All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're going to really dig into something that I think is so fascinating, and I know you're going to find it interesting too. Risk management for pilots. If you're like me, you want to learn about important stuff without having to spend a ton of time on it. So, we're going to try to make this a very efficient deep dive, right?
Yeah, that's the goal.
Yeah.
We've gone through a lot of material, so you don't have to.
Mhm.
And we're really zeroing in on what matters most for you, the individual pilot out there actually flying.
Right, exactly.
And to do that,
Hmm.
we've been mainly focusing on this handbook about risk management for pilots,
Mm.
which is interesting because it's a different approach than what you see in like bigger organizations with their safety management system.
Maybe SMS stuff.
Right. So this is more about you in the cockpit making decisions.
Right.
And we're going to extract the most important stuff from it.
So, no need for you guys to go and read, huge manuals.
Right.
We've done the hard work for you.
Exactly.
But the key message, and we're going to get into this, is that if you understand and really actively use these risk management principles that we're going to talk about, as pilots, you can improve your safety so much. You can feel so much more confident in your decisions and honestly have way more fun flying.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so let's get into this. The handbook starts off by talking about, what causes these aviation accidents in the first place. And they bring in two key players, which I know you're familiar with, but I think it's helpful to always sort of reset the NTSB and the FAA. And, we all know they investigate when bad stuff happens, but can you just sort of recap what each organization does, specifically?
Yeah, think of it this way. The NTSB, the National Transportation Safety Board, they're kind of like a learning system for aviation.
Yeah.
Their job is to go in after an accident, figure out what probably caused it, and then make safety recommendations to try to prevent it from happening again.
So they're not just like a historical, record keeper.
Right.
They're really trying to help us learn from these things.
Exactly. And those recommendations really point to, what kinds of risks pilots should be managing before they even get in the plane.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really valuable information for you as a pilot to kind of, anticipate what could go wrong.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Now, the FAA, on the other hand, they take a more like a big picture view. They're looking at whether an accident shows any weaknesses in the overall system. Things like, are there issues with pilot training programs? Are there problems with how aircraft are designed? Or even, how air traffic control works? Their goal is to make sure the rules and everything are set up for safety.
And it's not just those two organizations, right? I mean, depending on the accident, there are often other parties involved in these investigations.
Yeah, totally.
Ah,
You often have the companies that built the aircraft, the manufacturers, and the companies that operate them, the airlines or, whoever's using the plane. And they all bring their expertise to the table, trying to figure out what went wrong.
right, because they each have a different perspective and different knowledge, right? Absolutely.
To really kind of highlight how this all relates to, risk management for pilots like you listening, the handbook actually includes an excerpt from a real NTSB final report.
Right.
It's figure 1-1. Can you just walk us through kind of like the main points of this example and what it tells us about managing risk in aviation?
Yeah, what's really interesting about this example is that it shows, in a very concrete way, what can happen when risk management isn't done well. So the key findings that the NTSB had in this particular report were that the pilot didn't plan adequately before and during the flight, which led them to keep flying into some pretty bad weather, even after a very important part of their engine, the dry air vacuum pump, failed.
And that's important for people that maybe aren't as familiar with aircraft systems because that pump is what drives certain, essential instruments.
Yeah, exactly. It powers things like your attitude indicator, your directional gyro, things that tell you if you're right side up and where you're headed. So that's not something you want to lose.
Right. The second big finding from this report was that the pilot ended up losing control of the aircraft during the approach to land. So it's like one thing led to another, and the situation just kept getting worse. And, the handbook really makes a point of saying that this type of scenario where poor risk management is a major factor, it's sadly not unusual. It happens more often than you'd think in aviation incidents and accidents.
Right. This is not an isolated case.
No, not at all. And this report, it serves as a real wake-up call for pilots. It says, look, being proactive and thinking about risk in every decision you make when you're flying, it's not just a nice to have.
Right.
It's absolutely essential.
Yeah.
It's not just about how good you are at flying the plane. It's about how you manage the potential dangers that could come up
Right.
and make smart choices.
Okay, so that leads us to the next big thing the handbook talks about, which is this idea of the PAVE checklist. It's presented as this tool that can really help you analyze risk. Can you break down what PAV stands for and how it can be used by pilots?
Sure. So PAVE is a really good way to remember the different areas where hazards can pop up when you're flying. It's easy to remember, which is always good.
Yeah, mnemonics, very useful.
Right, exactly. So P stands for pilot, A stands for aircraft, V stands for environment, and E stands for external pressures.
Mm.
And by going through each one of these, you can get a really thorough view of all the possible risks that could affect your flight.
Okay, so let's kind of dive a little deeper into each one of those, starting with P, pilot. What sorts of things should a pilot be considering about themselves in this category?
P really focuses on, the human side of flying, all the things that can affect your performance as a pilot.
Right.
So we're talking about things like how much recent experience do you have? Are your skills sharp? Are your licenses and ratings up to date? Are you healthy? Are you feeling well rested? Are you dealing with any major stress that might affect your focus? Even your emotional state can matter.
It's a big difference between going up for, just a fun, flight on a beautiful day and, some serious mission.
Absolutely. And fatigue, huge one.
Right.
Are you getting enough sleep? And this is where, the handbook is this great example. I think you're going to remember this one, where the boss wanted the pilot to fly this long trip, but the pilot had only had like 4 hours of sleep.
Yeah. Yeah. And the weather was kind of iffy too, right?
Exactly. The weather was less than ideal. And what did the pilot do?
Well, made the smart choice, right?
Exactly, yeah.
They said, no, it's not safe. I'm not going.
They decided it was just too risky to fly in that condition. And, even though the boss wasn't happy about it at first, the pilot laid out all the reasons why it was just an unacceptable level of risk.
Yeah. Sometimes you just got to be firm, right?
Right.
For everyone's sake.
Exactly. And that's a perfect illustration of, good risk management in action. Safety comes first, even when someone's putting pressure on you to do otherwise.
100%. Okay, so moving on to A, aircraft.
Yeah.
What are some of the key things to be thinking about under that category?
Yeah, so under aircraft, you've got to evaluate everything about the plane you're going to fly. Is it capable of handling the flight you have planned? Like the distance, the weight, the weather conditions. Is all the equipment working correctly? Is it airworthy? Have all the maintenance been done? Are there any known issues or things that need fixing? The handbook is another good example here to illustrate this. Remember the one where the pilot found that little oil leak during their pre-flight check?
Yeah, during the walk around.
Right, during the walk-around, exactly.
Right.
Even though it was a small leak, they decided to be cautious and have a mechanic look at it before they took off. Smart move, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Because it turns out there was a loose oil cooler hose fitting that could have completely failed mid-flight. You can imagine what could have happened. It's a reminder that even seemingly small things can be huge red flags if you don't address them.
Yeah, you just don't want to ignore anything.
Right.
Exactly. Better safe than sorry.
Absolutely. So you got to pay attention to details and never just brush off something that doesn't seem quite right.
Okay, next up is E for environment. This feels like a pretty broad category. What all falls under this one?
Oh, yeah. Environment covers a lot. It includes everything that's happening outside the plane that could affect your flight. So obviously weather is a big one. Things like visibility, clouds, wind, temperature.
Right, that kind of stuff.
But it also includes stuff like how air traffic control is operating. How busy they are there any delays, things like that.
Right.
How reliable are your navigation systems, GPS, VORs, all that.
Yeah.
What's the terrain like where you're flying? Are there mountains? Are there obstacles?
Right.
What are the runways like that you'll be using? Are they long enough? Are they in good condition?
Right.
Are there any obstacles around the airport, like towers or buildings? The handbook gives a good example about wake turbulence, those invisible swirls of air that come off big planes. That really shows how important it is to consider your environment.
Yeah, remind me of that one.
Yeah, so it was a pilot landing a small plane, and a big jet had just taken off from a nearby runway. Now, this pilot, they had landed in similar conditions before, and they didn't think wake turbulence would be a problem.
Yeah, kind of got complacent, right?
Right, exactly. But what they didn't fully consider was how the wind was blowing that day. And, because of the wind, the wake turbulence from that jet actually drifted over to the runway where this smaller plane was landing, and they had a really rough landing. So the pilot's mistake was not understanding that the environment is always changing.
Yeah. Just because it was fine the last time doesn't mean it's fine this time.
Exactly.
Okay, so finally, V, for external pressures. What do we mean by external pressures when it comes to flying?
Yeah, external pressures are like those influences on your decision making that come from outside the actual flying itself.
Yeah.
It's about really understanding why you're making this flight, how important is it to stick to a schedule, is the goal of the trip worth taking on more risk? The handbook has a good example of a pilot doing a ferry flight. Do you remember that one?
Yeah, yeah, where they were delivering a plane
Yeah.
and they were like getting low on fuel.
Exactly. They were getting low on fuel and the weather was starting to get worse. And they had to decide, do I try to make it to my destination or do I stop and refuel?
And they chose to refuel, which was probably, the smart choice.
Yeah, absolutely. They recognized that, sticking to the original plan wasn't worth the risk, and they made the safe choice.
Right, right. Okay, so this PAVE checklist, it gives pilots a really good way to think through all these potential hazards before and during a flight.
Definitely.
I think it'd be helpful to go back to that NTSB report example and see how the PAVE framework sort of applies to that specific accident.
Yeah, for sure. When we look at that accident through the PAVE checklist, a few things really jump out. So first, under A for aircraft, the vacuum pump failing meant that the pilot didn't have reliable instruments to tell them if they were flying straight and level.
Yeah.
That alone was a big risk.
Yeah.
Right. And then, V for environment, the pilot decided to keep flying into instrument conditions, where you can't see the ground and you have to rely on your instruments. But remember, their instruments weren't working right. That just compounded the risk even more.
Right.
And then when you look at P for pilot, the report mentioned that the pilot told air traffic control that, flying in those conditions wasn't going to be a problem, even with the broken instruments.
That's a little scary.
Yeah, that kind of suggests that maybe the pilot was a little overconfident in their abilities. Maybe they weren't really grasping how dangerous the situation was. And that definitely falls under the P for pilot category.
Yeah. And for E, external pressures, I mean, we don't know for sure from the report if anything was pressuring the pilot to get to their destination, but it's certainly possible, right?
Yeah, it's definitely something to think about.
It seems like a huge missed opportunity in that whole situation was that the pilot didn't choose to land at another airport while they could still see where they were going.
You're right. While they were still in visual conditions, they had the option to land safely and avoid getting into that situation where they had to rely on instruments that weren't working. The fact that they didn't do that really highlights how important it is to assess risk accurately and make smart decisions in flight. As the handbook points out, a lot of times pilot error comes from overestimating your own skills, not being prepared enough for things to go wrong, or just not making safety the absolute top priority.
Yeah, well said. So this really highlights how valuable risk management training is for pilots. What do you think the main goals are of this type of training?
Yeah, the big goal of risk management training is to change the way pilots think about hazards, like, before they even get in the cockpit.
Yeah.
Make them more aware of what could go wrong and give them the tools to figure out how to handle those risks. And encourage them to always make the safe choice, both before the flight and during the flight, if things start to get a little hairy. The handbook really stresses that risk management isn't just a one-time thing. It's an ongoing process. It's about developing this habit of thinking ahead and avoiding those situations that could lead to an accident.
Yeah.
Like, it's about building that safety mindset from the ground up.
Yeah. And the chapter summary in the handbook, I think, really brings it all home.
Absolutely.
Reiterates that, unfortunately, a lot of accidents do happen because of poor risk management.
Yeah, that's a sobering thought, but important to keep in mind.
Right. And it really drives home the point that no matter what kind of flying you're doing, it doesn't matter if you're just out for a joyride or you're on a serious mission, risk management has to be part of the plan.
Yeah, totally agreed.
Okay, so wrapping up our deep dive today, we've seen how crucial it is for pilots to have a structured way to think about risk and how to manage it. That PAVE checklist, the pilot, aircraft, environment, external pressures, that gives you that structure.
It's a great tool.
And that NTSB report example we talked about, that really shows what can happen when you don't prioritize making smart, risk-based decisions when you're flying. For you listening out there, I think understanding all this gives you a deeper understanding of how aviation safety works and how important good judgment is, every time you fly.
I think so too. And on that note, here's something to think about. We've been talking about PAV in the context of flying, but where else in your life could you use this same kind of framework to, manage risk and make better decisions?
That's an interesting question.
Right. Think about it. Maybe it's a big project at work. Maybe it's a personal goal you have, like, getting healthier. Or maybe you're planning a big trip. You might be surprised how useful this way of thinking about risk can be in all sorts of situations.
That's a great takeaway. All right, well, thanks for joining us for another deep dive.
Thanks for having me.